very famous moment. John DeLorean and two of his highly placed engineers, a gentleman by the name of Russ G. and the other by the name of Bill Collins, one an engine man, one a chassis man, were at the General Motors proving grounds in the Pontiac garage, and they were looking at it, feeding the exhaust system under what was going to be a 64 Le Mans. And it was Bill Collins, as a matter of fact, the chassis man, who said to John very jokingly, he says, you know, John, I could take this 326 out of here and stick a 389 in here in about an hour. And John looked at him and kind of, chuckled a minute. Then he looked at Russ G., and he got a nod of approval from Russ G., and together they all said, let's do it. And within a week, the car was actually built. And then, of course, was used as kind of a test vehicle. It took really another couple of months before they finally decided, let's do it. And of course, that in itself is a whole other story, which I don't know that I even have time. I'll very quickly cover it. The car was in the marketplace, in the dealerships, before the General Motors executives ever found out that it existed. Now, how did they do that? Well, in those days, each division had their own manufacturing facility, and they could control the manufacture. That couldn't be done today. General Motors has an assembly division today, and all the cars are made under the General Motors assembly division. At that time, Pontiac had a factory in Pontiac. And so they decided to build 5,000 of these cars. They took their salesmen, their district managers, and went out to the dealers and said, we're going to have this very special car. We think you ought to have one or two. Most of the dealers didn't want anything to do with it. The bigger dealers ordered 4 or 5. And so when it came time, they suddenly rolled up in front of the dealerships. And here was this car called GTO. Up till that time, nobody even knew the name. And of course, every dealership had a guy who thought he was a hot shoe, was a salesman who thought he was a real driver. He took this thing around the block and came back ashen-faced and said, oh my God. Well, the Pontiac dealers then decided, okay, let's get 10 more. Well, there weren't 10 more. They only built 5,000. But what they did, unfortunately, was to take it over and show it off to their Chevrolet and Oldsmobile and Buick buddies. Took them for a ride and said, look what I got you haven't got. Needless to say, the Chevy and the Olds and the Buick guys complained. So the corporation knew about the existence of the car before Pontiac ever got around to telling them. So when they summoned the Pontiac folks down, and I have to tell you, the only reason I know so much about this is that I was asked to write the presentation so that John DeLorean and Pete Estes from Pontiac could go down to the corporation and tell them what they had done and why. Well, before that date came up, the Pontiac dealers had sold and reordered 15,000 more GTOs. So all Mr. DeLorean and Mr. Estes had to do was go downtown to the corporation, put in front of them 15,000 new dealer orders, and it was a done deal. They quickly turned around to Chevrolet and Olds and Buick and said, you can do it too. Which is why the 442 and the Grand Sport and the SS models appeared later than the GTO. And as a matter of fact, one more little interesting point, all of us who have Pontiacs know that regardless of the size of the engine, all of the exterior dimensions on the Pontiac block is the same. So it was no problem to pull a 326 out and stuff a 389 in. The motor mounts were virtually the same. Well, when Chevrolet went to work, they realized they had 2 engines. Oldsmobile had 2 engines. Buick had 2 engines. So their performance cars, the Grand Sports, the Super Sports, the 442s, did come out in '64, but with smaller engines. And it wasn't until 1965 that a real, true muscle car came out of Chevrolet and Buick and Olds. Pontiac had a running start on them, which they never gave up.
Okay, how long?